November 1951. The bathroom tiles of a Manhattan hotel suite are stained with something darker than the whiskey that had been Frank Sinatra's only companion for weeks. In the mirror above the sink, the face that had once charmed millions of screaming Bobby Soxers stares back with hollow eyes. The famous blue gaze now clouded with the kind of desperation that no spotlight could illuminate. The razor blade trembles in his hand as blood drips from his wrist into the porcelain basin, each drop marking the end of what had once seemed like an unstoppable rise to the top of American entertainment. This is Frank Sinatra at his lowest point, his recording contract canceled, his movie career in ruins, his personal life a wasteland of broken marriages and shattered dreams. The man who had sung "I've Got the World on a String" now dangles from that very string, discovering that fame could be as fragile as the crystal glasses he used to shatter with his voice. But in this moment of self-destruction, something else is being born, a hunger for redemption that would transform him from a fallen teen idol into an immortal American icon. The voice that would eventually conquer Las Vegas, Hollywood, and the hearts of a nation is bleeding out in a bathroom, but Frank Sinatra refuses to die quietly. This isn't just another celebrity breakdown. This is the moment when a man discovers that the only thing more powerful than success is the determination to reclaim it after losing everything. The kid from Hoboken who had clawed his way to the top was about to learn that falling from grace was only the beginning of his real story. But Frank Sinatra's survival that night wasn't just about personal resilience. It was about understanding that in America, reinvention wasn't just possible, it was essential. The entertainment industry that had built him up and torn him down was about to discover that some voices refused to be silenced, and that the most dangerous performer is one who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Was this really a suicide attempt? Or was something far more calculating at play? In Sinatra's case, the line between genuine despair and theatrical gesture was always thin, and even his most private moments seemed choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. The man who lived his entire life as a performance may have been performing even for himself that night, creating a scene of rock bottom that would justify the spectacular comeback he was already plotting. The blood on those bathroom tiles represented more than just physical pain. It was the price of admission to a new phase of his career, one where vulnerability would become his greatest strength, and his darkest impulses would fuel his most brilliant artistry. To understand how Frank Sinatra became both the voice of America and its most troubling contradiction, we must first understand how a skinny kid from New Jersey learned that survival meant becoming whoever the audience needed him to be. December 12th, 1915. Francis Albert Sinatra entered the world in Hoboken, New Jersey during a delivery so difficult that the doctor's forceps left permanent scars on his neck and punctured his eardrum. Marks that would later be hidden by carefully styled hair and compensated for by a voice that seemed to hear frequencies others couldn't detect. His mother, Dolly, was a fierce Italian-American woman who understood that in Depression-era America, respectability was a luxury that immigrant families couldn't afford, and that sometimes you had to break a few rules to give your children a chance at something better. The Sinatra household was a study in contrasts that would define Frank's entire approach to life. His father, Marty, was a quiet boxer-turned-tavern keeper who preferred to stay in the background, while Dolly was a political force in local Democratic circles who knew that power came not from following the rules, but from understanding who made them and why. Young Frank learned early that charm could be a weapon, that being underestimated was an advantage, and that the difference between success and failure often came down to who was willing to do what others wouldn't. The neighborhood where Frank grew up was a melting pot of Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants who had learned that survival in America required a delicate balance between assimilation and maintaining your identity. The streets of Hoboken were Frank's first stage, where he discovered that making people laugh, cry, or simply pay attention to him was a form of power that couldn't be taken away by economic hardship or social prejudice. His early fascination with music wasn't just artistic, it was strategic. Frank understood instinctively that singing could be a ticket out of Hoboken, a way to transform himself from the son of immigrants into something purely American. But he also recognized that entertainment was about more than just talent. It was about creating a persona that audiences would want to believe in, even if that persona bore little resemblance to the person behind it. Could this early understanding of performance as survival have been what enabled Frank to reinvent himself so completely throughout his career? Or was it the source of the identity confusion that would plague him for the rest of his life? The teenage Frank who dropped out of high school to pursue music wasn't just rebelling against education. He was making a calculated bet that talent combined with ambition could overcome the limitations that society placed on people like him. The decision horrified his parents but revealed something essential about Frank's character. He was willing to risk everything on his belief in himself, even when that belief wasn't shared by anyone else. His early performances in local clubs and social halls were laboratories for developing the stage presence that would later make him famous. Frank was learning to read audiences, to understand what they needed from him emotionally, and to give them just enough of his real self to make the performance feel authentic without revealing anything that might make him vulnerable to attack. The voice that would eventually be known as The Voice was still developing during these early years, but Frank was already demonstrating the interpretive skills that would set him apart from other singers. He understood that a song wasn't just a collection of notes and words. It was a story that needed to be told with enough conviction to make strangers believe it was their story too. But Frank was also learning some darker lessons about the entertainment business. He discovered that talent alone wasn't enough, that success often required connections that went beyond the legitimate music industry, and that sometimes the difference between stardom and obscurity came down to who was willing to do business with whom. These early compromises would later cast shadows over his entire career, but they also taught him that moral purity was a luxury that ambitious people couldn't afford. The breakthrough that launched Frank Sinatra from local club singer to national phenomenon came in 1940 when he joined the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. But success also introduced him to pressures and temptations that would both elevate and torment him for the rest of his life. Working with Dorsey was like getting a graduate education in professional music. But it was also an initiation into a world where artistic achievement was inseparable from business relationships that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. The technique that would make Frank's voice distinctive, his ability to sustain long phrases without seeming to breathe, was learned from watching Dorsey play trombone, but Frank adapted it into something more intimate and emotionally direct than instrumental music could achieve. He was developing the ability to make listeners feel like he was singing directly to them, sharing secrets that no one else could hear. But the Dorsey years also introduced Frank to the lifestyle that would define his public image. Late nights, heavy drinking, complex relationships with women, and an understanding that entertainment was as much about myth-making as it was about music. Frank was learning to be Frank Sinatra, a character that was based on Francis Albert Sinatra but amplified and polished for public consumption. The romantic ballads that made him famous during this period weren't just songs. They were emotional templates that taught an entire generation how to think about love, longing, and loss. Frank was becoming more than an entertainer. He was becoming a guide to the emotional landscape of mid-century America, someone who could articulate feelings that his audience couldn't express themselves. The screaming teenage girls who mobbed his early solo performances in the mid-1940s represented something unprecedented in American culture. The creation of a male sex symbol who appealed to female desire in ways that were both romantic and slightly dangerous. Frank wasn't just singing love songs, He was embodying the possibility of passion that transcended the conventional boundaries of middle-class respectability. But this early fame also came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Frank was learning that being a symbol meant that his private life would always be public property, that his relationships would be subject to scrutiny and judgment, and that the very qualities that made him attractive to audiences could also make his personal relationships unstable and complex. Behind all that charm and confidence, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody could see? The answer would become clear during the late 1940s when Frank's career began to falter and the carefully constructed image he had built started to crack under the pressure of changing public tastes and personal scandals that revealed the man behind the myth. The Bobby Soxers who had screamed for him were growing up and getting married, and their husbands weren't particularly interested in supporting a singer whose romantic appeal threatened their own domestic arrangements. The decline that led to that bathroom in 1951 wasn't sudden. It was a gradual erosion of everything Frank had built, made worse by his inability to adapt to a changing entertainment landscape and his tendency to respond to professional setbacks with personal self-destruction. The voice that had once seemed effortless was becoming strained, the charm was curdling into arrogance, and the romantic image was being tarnished by very public marital problems and rumored connections to organized crime. The relationship with Ava Gardner that dominated this period was both the great love of Frank's life and the catalyst for his professional and personal collapse. Ava was everything Frank thought he wanted: beautiful, talented, independent, and completely unimpressed by his fame. But she was also emotionally unavailable in ways that drove him to distraction and desperation. Their romance played out like a noir film with passion and jealousy and violence simmering just beneath the surface of Hollywood glamour. Frank wrote to her, "You are the only woman I ever loved. Without you, I am nothing." Words that revealed the depth of his emotional dependence and the fragility of his carefully constructed self-confidence. The marriage was doomed from the beginning, not because they didn't love each other, but because they loved each other in ways that were too intense and destructive to sustain. Frank needed Ava to validate his worth as a man, while Ava needed independence that Frank's possessiveness made impossible. Their fights were legendary. Their reconciliations were temporary, and their ultimate divorce was inevitable. But the relationship taught Frank something crucial about the connection between emotional pain and artistic authenticity. Did this tragic relationship mark his downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The answer lay in understanding that Frank's relationship with Ava was a symptom of larger issues about identity, success, and the price of living as a public figure. Frank had spent so many years being what other people needed him to be that he had lost touch with who he actually was beneath the performance, and Ava's rejection forced him to confront the possibility that there might not be anyone there at all. The professional failures of the early 1950s were made worse by Frank's tendency to respond to criticism with anger and his inability to accept that the entertainment business was changing in ways that left little room for the kind of romantic crooner he had been. Television was replacing radio, rock and roll was challenging traditional pop music, and audiences were looking for entertainers who seemed more authentic and less polished than the pre-war generation of performers. But Frank's lowest point also contained the seeds of his greatest triumph. The desperation that led him to that hotel bathroom also freed him from the need to maintain an image that was no longer working, and the artistic hunger that came from having nothing left to lose would fuel the most creative period of his entire career. The comeback that transformed Frank Sinatra from a washed-up crooner into an immortal American icon began with his casting in From Here to Eternity in 1953. But the real resurrection was internal, a decision to stop trying to be the person he had been and start becoming the person he needed to be. The role of Maggio in the war film wasn't just an acting job. It was a chance for Frank to channel his own experiences of defeat and humiliation into a performance that felt raw and authentic in ways his music hadn't for years. Winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor didn't just revive Frank's career. It proved that his talent extended beyond singing, and that he could reinvent himself as something more complex and interesting than a simple entertainer. But more importantly, it demonstrated that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that audiences were hungry for performers who were willing to show their scars. The recording contract with Capitol Records that followed represented a complete artistic rebirth. Working with arrangers like Nelson Riddle, Frank developed a more mature sound that acknowledged both his vocal limitations and his increased emotional depth. The voice that had once been smooth and effortless now carried traces of whiskey and cigarettes and heartbreak. But these imperfections made his interpretations more compelling rather than less. Albums like In the Wee Small Hours and Songs for Swingin Lovers weren't just collections of songs. They were emotional narratives that told the story of a man who had been broken by love and success and had found a way to transform that brokenness into art. Frank was no longer just singing about romantic feelings. He was embodying the full spectrum of adult emotional experience, from joy to despair and everything in between. The transformation wasn't just musical, it was complete reinvention of his public persona. The skinny kid from Hoboken became the chairman of the board, a figure who combined artistic sophistication with an edge of danger that suggested he had seen and done things that most people only fantasized about. This new Frank Sinatra was attractive not because he was safe, but because he was slightly dangerous. Not because he was perfect, but because he was authentically flawed. The Rat Pack that formed around Frank during this period wasn't just a group of friends. It was a carefully crafted image of masculine sophistication that defined an entire era's understanding of what it meant to be cool. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop weren't just drinking buddies, they were co-conspirators in creating a fantasy of adult male friendship that combined professional success with personal loyalty and just enough moral ambiguity to keep things interesting. Las Vegas became Frank's kingdom during the 1960s, and his performances at the Sands Hotel represented the pinnacle of American entertainment sophistication. The shows weren't just concerts. They were events that combined music, comedy, and an atmosphere of exclusive insider knowledge that made audiences feel like they were part of something special and slightly illicit. But even at the height of his success, Frank was struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed him in the early 1950s. The loneliness that fame couldn't cure, the need for approval that success couldn't satisfy, and the anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of his charm were all still there, hidden behind increasingly elaborate performances of confidence and control. The political connections that Frank cultivated during this period, particularly his relationship with John F. Kennedy, represented his ultimate ambition, to be not just an entertainer but a power broker who could influence the course of American history. But these relationships also introduced new complications and dangers, particularly when Frank's organized crime connections became a liability for politicians who needed to maintain their distance from anything that might suggest corruption. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Frank's case suggested that the answer was both yes and no. He had successfully reinvented himself professionally and personally, but the methods he used to achieve that reinvention, the connections to organized crime, the willingness to use intimidation and violence when charm failed, the tendency to see relationships as transactions that could be negotiated, were themselves sources of ongoing controversy and personal isolation. The rumors about Frank's connections to organized crime figures like Sam Giancana and Lucky Luciano were never definitively proven, but they cast a shadow over his entire career that he could never completely escape. The FBI surveillance that began during the 1940s continued for decades, creating a permanent cloud of suspicion that affected his political relationships and limited his ability to move freely in certain circles. But Frank also used these rumors strategically, understanding that the suggestion of danger made him more interesting to audiences and gave him a form of power that pure artistic talent couldn't provide. The ambiguity about whether he was actually connected to organized crime or just cultivating that image for effect became part of his mystique, a question that he never answered directly because the uncertainty served his purposes better than the truth would have. The personal relationships of this period were marked by the same combination of genuine affection and calculated manipulation that characterized his professional life. Frank was capable of extraordinary generosity and loyalty, but he also expected absolute devotion in return, and could be ruthless when he felt betrayed or abandoned. His marriage to Mia Farrow in 1966 represented an attempt to recapture some of the romantic intensity he had experienced with Ava Gardner. But the 29-year age difference and their completely different approaches to life and career made the relationship unsustainable. Frank wanted a traditional wife who would support his career and social ambitions, while Mia was an independent artist who had her own creative goals and wasn't willing to subordinate them to his needs. The tension between Frank's public image as a swinging bachelor and his private need for stable romantic relationships created a pattern of marriage and divorce that reflected his broader struggle to balance his authentic desires with the demands of maintaining his carefully constructed persona. The later years of Frank Sinatra's career were marked by both artistic achievement and personal decline, as the voice that had defined American popular music for 4 decades began to show the effects of age, alcohol, and the accumulated stress of living as both a performer and a symbol. The concerts of the 1970s and 1980s demonstrated that his interpretive skills had only deepened with age. But they also revealed a man who was increasingly isolated by his fame and struggling to maintain connections to a world that had changed dramatically since his youth. The recording of My Way in 1969 became Frank's unofficial autobiography, a song that seemed to summarize his entire approach to life and career. But the defiant individualism of the lyrics masked a more complex reality. Frank had spent his entire life being shaped by the expectations and demands of others, and his greatest achievement may have been his ability to make that accommodation look like rebellion. The health problems that began to affect him during the 1980s weren't just physical. They were emotional and psychological consequences of a lifetime spent performing versions of himself for public consumption. The man who had always prided himself on his energy and stamina was forced to confront the reality that even the voice was mortal, that even the most carefully constructed image couldn't protect against the inevitable effects of time. But Frank's refusal to retire gracefully, his insistence on continuing to perform even when his voice was clearly diminished, reflected something essential about his character. The understanding that for him, stopping meant dying, and that as long as he could stand on a stage and hold a microphone, he could still be Frank Sinatra rather than just Francis Albert Sinatra, the skinny kid from Hoboken who had been pretending to be someone else for so long that he had forgotten where the performance ended and the person began. The late-night phone calls to friends and acquaintances that became legendary during this period weren't just about loneliness. They were about Frank's terror of silence, his need to hear human voices that could confirm he still existed when the spotlights were turned off and the applause had faded. The man who had spent his life being the center of attention discovered that fame could be the most isolating experience of all, creating barriers to authentic human connection that were almost impossible to overcome. Were these final years acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The answer depended on whether you saw Frank's continued performing as a desperate attempt to cling to past glories or as a heroic refusal to let age and illness define the terms of his existence. The concerts of the 1980s and early 1990s were often painful to watch, but they also demonstrated something admirable about Frank's refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose on him. The charity work that consumed much of his later years represented perhaps his most authentic self. A man who understood what it meant to struggle and who was willing to use his fame and fortune to help others who were facing their own battles with poverty, illness, and discrimination. Frank's support for civil rights causes, particularly his friendship with Sammy Davis Jr., and his willingness to challenge segregation in entertainment venues, showed that his understanding of what it meant to be an outsider in America wasn't just personal, but political. But even his generosity was complicated by his need for control and recognition. Frank's charitable giving often came with strings attached, and his support for causes was sometimes contingent on his ability to play a central role in their activities. The man who sang about doing it his way had never learned to help others without making it about himself as well. May 14th, 1998. Frank Sinatra died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, his final breath marking the end of an era in American entertainment and the beginning of a legend that would prove even more powerful than the reality had been. The immediate response to his death revealed the profound impact he had made not just on popular music but on American culture itself. Radio stations across the country played his music in tribute. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor, and politicians, entertainers, and ordinary fans shared memories of how his voice had provided the soundtrack to their most important moments. The funeral was a study in contrasts that perfectly captured the complexity of Frank's life and career. The private service was attended by family and close friends, who mourned the loss of a man they had known and loved despite his flaws, while the public memorial attracted celebrities and politicians who came to pay their respects to an icon whose influence had extended far beyond entertainment. But the most telling aspect of the immediate aftermath was how quickly the controversies that had surrounded Frank during his lifetime began to fade, replaced by a focus on his artistic achievements and his role in defining what it meant to be a sophisticated American entertainer. The organized crime connections that had fascinated the FBI for decades became footnotes to a larger story about talent, ambition, and the price of fame in mid-century America. The estate Frank left behind was substantial but complicated, reflecting a lifetime of complex business relationships and personal obligations that would take years to sort out. His most valuable asset wasn't his financial holdings but his catalog of recordings, which would continue to generate income and influence new generations of musicians long after his death. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Frank's case, the powerful forces were the same ones that had shaped his entire life: the entertainment industry that had made him famous, the organized crime figures who had complicated his career, and the political establishment that had both embraced and rejected him depending on their needs. But by 1998, Frank Sinatra was too old and too sick to be a threat to anyone, and his death was simply the natural conclusion to a life that had burned brighter and longer than most. The immediate impact on popular music was profound but not immediately obvious. Frank had been performing for so long that many younger listeners thought of him as a relic from an earlier era. But his death prompted a re-evaluation of his contributions to American song interpretation and his influence on everyone from jazz singers to rock performers who had learned from his approach to phrasing, emotion, and stage presence. The broader cultural impact of his death was to highlight how much American entertainment had changed since Frank's heyday, and how different the relationship between performers and audiences had become. Frank had been one of the last entertainers who could command respect and attention simply by walking onto a stage, who could make audiences feel privileged to be in his presence rather than entitled to his entertainment. In the years following his death, Frank's reputation has only grown as new generations of listeners have discovered his recordings and recognized their enduring quality. The techniques he pioneered in song interpretation have become the foundation for much of contemporary popular music, and his understanding of how to create emotional intimacy with an audience through recorded music remains unmatched. The tragic irony of Frank's legacy is that he achieved in death the kind of universal acclaim that had sometimes eluded him in life. The controversies that had complicated his career were overshadowed by recognition of his artistic achievements, and the personal flaws that had made him a difficult man to know became part of what made him a compelling figure to study and admire. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind his public image? The biggest secrets may be the simplest ones, that Frank Sinatra was fundamentally a lonely man who spent his entire life trying to fill an emotional void that fame and success could never quite satisfy, and that his greatest achievement was his ability to transform that loneliness into art that helped millions of other people feel less alone. The music industry gradually developed a better understanding of the psychological pressures faced by performers, though Frank's story served as a reminder that talent and success without emotional support were dangerous combinations. His career became a case study in both the possibilities and the perils of American celebrity, showing how the same qualities that made someone a star could also make them vulnerable to exploitation and self-destruction. As understanding of the entertainment business improved, Frank's career was recontextualized as an example of what could be achieved when talent was combined with ambition and strategic thinking, but also as a warning about the costs of living a life where the performance never really ended, and the person behind the image remained forever mysterious, even to himself. The ultimate question that Frank's life raised, whether artistic greatness required the kind of emotional intensity and moral ambiguity that made his personal life so complicated, or whether he might have been even greater if he had found ways to be more authentic and less calculated, remained unanswered but continued to fascinate anyone who had ever wondered about the relationship between art and life, between performance and identity. Frank Sinatra had been the voice of American sophistication, but more importantly, he had been the first entertainer to prove that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that admitting your flaws could make you more attractive rather than less, and that the most powerful performances came not from perfection but from the willingness to let audiences see your scars. In a world that often demanded simple answers to complex questions, Frank Sinatra had spent his entire career proving that the most interesting people were the ones who contained contradictions, who could be both tender and tough, both generous and selfish, both inspiring and deeply flawed. His music had been the soundtrack to the American century because it captured all the promise and disappointment, all the dreams and disillusionment that defined the national experience. The boy from Hoboken who had become the chairman of the board had taught the world that reinvention was possible, but that it came with costs that could never be fully calculated in advance. His voice had conquered 3 generations of listeners not because it was perfect but because it was honest about its imperfections, not because it promised easy answers but because it acknowledged that the most important questions didn't have answers at all. Glory can explode, collapse, and then be reborn. But the price was a lifetime of performing yourself into existence, of becoming so skilled at being what others needed that you lost track of what you needed for yourself. Frank Sinatra did it his way, but his way was also everyone else's way, and the tension between those two truths created both his greatest triumphs and his deepest regrets. In the end, alcohol may have been man's worst enemy, but Frank had learned to love his enemies as much as his friends, understanding that both were necessary ingredients in the kind of life that was worth singing about, even when that life threatened to destroy the person who was living it.